Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to see the witnesses, especially my former colleague, Jane. Nice to see you. I traveled with my former colleague, Mike Pompeo, to the Middle East, met with Netanyahu. He talked about the Shia Crescent, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, coming out of Iran. And at the time, we were talking about this Iran deal, and we were opposed to it for a couple of reasons, all of which are being negotiated in this E3 agreement. He and I didn't think the inspections were sufficient enough. Didn't include military sites where most likely that's where they would build a nuclear weapon. The ICBM capability was not addressed. I asked Secretary Kerry right here why that wasn't in the deal, and he simply said it just couldn't be done. Sunset provisions has been talked about. And then the terror financing from a Chairman of Homeland Security standpoint, hundreds of billions of dollars unleashed, and now look what we have. So we're in a bit of a dilemma, I think. I think this E3 agreement was a good idea. I was hopeful it would happen. I know the sunset provisions were a problem in reaching a consensus. But I think the question is, well, a couple. I mean, my understanding is Iran would have to agree to this as well. Do you think if the E3 reached an agreement with the United States that Iran would join in that agreement?
So the sunset clause is a problem. And I actually think the Trump administration came up with a clever way to address that problem. Because I mean, implicit in your question is, you know, would Iran ever agree to eliminate the sunset clause? I mean, they might agree to it, but not for free. You know, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I talk about it in my prepared remarks. But the Trump solution, at least what he's been trying to negotiate with the Europeans and what he asked the Congress to do is, forget about the Iranians. We'll just declare what our policy is going to be once the sunset clause kicks in. They don't have to agree to that. We just declare this is what we're going to do. And what we're going to do is we're not going to threaten to bomb them, as some people say we should threaten. Although maybe, you know, we don't necessarily not threaten to do that. But the threat we will bring to bear is the threat that we'll impose economic sanctions if they enrich uranium in a way that would get them a very short breakout capability. No need for the Iranians to agree to that. So it's all it requires is the agreement of the three governments in Europe. So, you know, a realistically achievable concept, I think. Now, you know, while we're talking about negotiations, though, you know, I predicted in my initial statement here that before this administration is over, I think President Trump probably is going to negotiate with the Iranians because he's negotiating next month with the North Koreans. And those who you know, among those who have argued that the president should not allow or should not walk away from the JCPOA, many have said, well, what he should do is negotiate the problem of the sunset clause with Iran. I think there will be such a negotiation, but as things stand today, we're going to have to give them something to give up on the sunset clause. The only thing I think realistically we have to give them, well, we could write them enormous checks. Okay, we could give them a bunch of money. I don't think we're going to do that.
No,
the other thing,
I have about a minute and a half. So
the other thing we could give them is relief from the primary embargo,
okay,
which is what we imposed because of their support for terrorism. And so we could trade our policy, our counterterrorism policy, for concessions from them on their nuclear program. The question I ask in my prepared statement is, then what's left of our anti-terrorism policy if we've given away our primary embargo in order to get additional concessions?
No, I agree. The sunset clause, I mean, that's the big sticking point, but is it better to get out entirely, or do we want to extend the deadline on these negotiations rather than pull out completely?
I think that everyone shares the goal of, except perhaps Iran, of extending the deadline. But the question we're all raising is, what's the best way to achieve the goal? And pulling out, or at least decertifying the deal today, is not the best way to achieve the goal. And you know, I would just make one other point, which is negotiations are tough. Each party has to give up something to get to a deal. I'm sure that John Kerry and others would say they wanted a stronger deal than they got. They got the deal that they got. And, you know, as a mother of four, I know that perfection is not an option. You've got to negotiate with your own kids to get a little, to get some progress.
And I have five. Just one last question. I worry too, Jane, that it will shift attention away from Iran and put it on the United States. That's one of my concerns from a foreign policy standpoint. Finally, you talk about congressional inaction, and perhaps we ought to, if we can't reach this E3 agreement, then perhaps Congress should take action and deal with this issue head on, whether it be the sanctions or, as you mentioned, the AUMF. And I would like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I've mentioned the AOMF a couple of times because I think Congress is AWOL, and Congress should be doing this. And the 2001 AUMF that most of us who are here voted for, it seems to me doesn't apply to this situation at all. And a future with a re-nuclearized Iran, or Iran rebuilding the bomb it stopped building, is one that will require some kind of military response. So I want Congress to set the contours. Second point, though, what is our strategy in the Middle East? What do our allies perceive our strategy is? I think it should be working, as we've all said, with Europe, who were in this deal in the first place, and hopefully with China and Russia, too, to contain nuclear developments in the region. And if a result of this is that the Saudis or others decide to build a nuclear weapon, and the Saudis could acquire technology from Pakistan, or at least that's the rumor, I don't think the Middle East becomes more stable. So there are very serious problems, it seems to me, with pulling out, as might happen today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.